Hello. In this tutorial, you'll learn how to set up slicers to control multiple pivot tables in your workbooks. For this lesson, we'll be using the employment dataset. If you're not sure how to create a pivot table, stop here and watch that video first. I'll be here when you're ready. In a previous video, you saw how slicers could be used to filter your pivot tables quickly and easily. Well, in this video, we're going to make slicers even better. By connecting a slicer to multiple pivot tables, you can update all of the tables at once. The best part is, it's easy to do. So let's get started. We'll start by making a pivot table. Our data's on sheet 1, so we'll go there. Under the Insert tab on the ribbon, we'll click on the Pivot Table button. By default, Excel will select all the data on the sheet here, but you want to make sure that the area for Select a Table or Range contains all the data on the worksheet. We're going to end up with quite a few things on the screen, so I'm going to place this pivot table on sheet 2 in cell A1. So I'll highlight the location, and then we'll move to sheet 2, and I'll select cell A1. For this table, let's use region and position for our rows, and we'll use salary as the values field. Here I'll change the formatting for the salary field from the sum of salary. We'll summarize it as the average instead. And we'll change the number format to currency and make sure that we have 2 decimal places so that this shows correctly. Good. Now let's make a second pivot table using the same source data but showing some slightly different information. It's important to know that you have to use the same source data for pivot tables that will share slicers. If the source data isn't the same, you won't be able to connect the second table to the slicer. We'll come back to sheet 1. We'll go to Insert, Pivot Table. Once again, Excel automatically selects our data, so we've got the correct data range. And this time we want to place this in sheet 2, cell D1. Good. For this table, let's use region and gender instead of position for the rows, and we'll continue to use the salary field for values. I'll go ahead and reformat the sum of salaries here to be the average and change the number format to currency. And again, make sure that we have 2 decimal places. And we have our second pivot table. Now the fun begins. Let's make some slicers for the first table. Click on any cell in that table. Then on the Options tab, under Pivot Table Tools, click on the Insert Slicer button. You'll see a dialog box open with all the fields you can use related to this pivot table. Check the boxes for region and position, and then click OK. You'll see that Excel includes the slicers, and these are graphical objects, so you can move them around, you can resize them, and so I'll just resize them real quickly here and put them in between these 2 tables to make it a little easier for us to read. Good. And now you can see that these slicers work just fine for table 1, but they don't do anything to table 2 yet. To connect the slicers to pivot table 2, we'll click on any cell in that table. Then, on the Options tab under Pivot Table Tools, click on the drop-down menu for Insert Slicers and select Slicer Connections. If this selection isn't available, go back and make sure that you use the same source data to create both pivot tables. The dialog box that opens gives a list of all the slicers that can be connected to this table. Let's check the boxes for both slicers and then we'll click OK. Now you can see that the slicers change the data for both pivot tables at the same time. Pretty cool, huh? Let's make one more slicer so you can get the process down. Click on any cell in the second pivot table. Then, under the Options tab, click on Insert Slicer. Check the box for gender, and then click OK. I'll go ahead and move and then resize this slicer. Now the slicer works fine for pivot table 2, but we want to connect it to the first one as well. To do that, we'll click on any cell in the first pivot table. Then on the Options tab, under Pivot Table Tools, we'll click on the drop-down menu under Insert Slicer and choose Slicer Connections. You'll notice that the checkbox for the gender slicer isn't connected. We'll check that box and then we'll click OK. Now both pivot tables share all three slicers, and they can be filtered at the same time according to any criteria you want. This has been an example of how to connect slicers to multiple pivot tables in Microsoft Excel. I'll see you in the next video.